A secret love affair between a sheriff's wife and two deputies unfolds, hidden beneath a facade of loyalty and trust. As betrayal brews and passions ignite, one fateful night turns their lives into a deadly game of deceit, leading to a chilling confrontation no one saw coming. Redfield, Montana, 2009. Sheriff Daniel Carson, a man revered and feared in equal measure, led the county with a firm hand. At 52, he had built his career on respect, and his towering presence was enough to quiet the most unruly of disputes. But even the strongest among us have cracks, and Sheriff Carson's had just begun to show. It started with whispers. Among the deputies and townsfolk, murmurs spread of tension in the sheriff's home. His wife, Emily Carson, was 38, striking, quick-witted, and known for her charm. For years, she had stood by Daniel's side, the quintessential sheriff's wife. But the past months had seen her grow distant, eyes often clouded with a sadness she tried to hide. To the townsfolk, it was an unspoken mystery. To Daniel, it was a slowly unraveling nightmare. On the night of June 15th, 2009, the Carsons hosted a gathering at their modest ranch. It was a tradition, a time for deputies and their families to relax and bond. Drinks flowed, laughter echoed, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He watched as Emily moved effortlessly among the guests, her laughter a little too loud, her smiles a little too bright. His eyes followed her as she shared a quiet moment with Deputy Tom Rivers. Rivers was younger, sharp-eyed, and charismatic, the kind of man who commanded attention wherever he went. Daniel's jaw tightened. It was nothing, he told himself. But doubt had already taken root. Across the yard, Deputy Greg Mason caught Daniel's gaze and offered a reassuring nod. Mason had been Daniel's right-hand man for over a decade. Solid, dependable, someone Daniel trusted implicitly. Yet even as he sought comfort in Greg's steady presence, Daniel noticed how Mason's eyes lingered on Emily too long. His chest tightened. Was it just his imagination, paranoia creeping in, or was there more to it? As the night wore on, Daniel tried to push the thoughts aside, but they gnawed at him, relentless. He caught glimpses of Emily and Rivers together, then Mason joining them in hushed conversations that quickly ended when he drew near. The tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to erupt. Daniel kept his composure, barely. He knew he couldn't afford to show weakness, not in front of his men. But inside, a storm was brewing. By midnight, the gathering had wound down. Deputies and their families filtered out, leaving the house in a hush. Daniel stood on the porch, watching Emily as she cleaned up in silence. "Is there something you're not telling me?" he asked, his voice low and edged with steel. Emily didn't look up. "I'm tired, Daniel. We can talk later." "Later," he echoed bitterly. The word felt like a knife in his gut. They'd been putting things off for months, and now he knew why. But he wasn't ready to confront it, not without proof. In the days that followed, Daniel threw himself into his work. He tried to ignore the way Emily's demeanor changed when she thought he wasn't looking, or how Rivers and Mason avoided meeting his eyes. The signs were there. But he needed more than suspicions. He needed answers. On June 22nd, he stayed late at the station, poring over reports he'd already read a dozen times. The clock ticked past midnight when his phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You need to know what's happening in your own house." The message was followed by an address, the cabin on Hollow Creek Road, a place Daniel knew all too well. It had once been a retreat for him and Emily in happier times. His blood ran cold. He grabbed his keys and drove, the night swallowing him whole. As he approached the cabin, he saw a single light in the window. He parked his truck a good distance away and moved quietly through the trees. His breath caught in his throat when he saw them, Emily, Tom Rivers, and Greg Mason. Their conversation was heated, gestures wild. Daniel strained to hear, but caught only fragments. Words of betrayal, fear, desperation. Suddenly, Mason grabbed Emily's arm and Rivers stepped between them. Voices rose. Daniel's instincts took over. He stormed out of the shadows, gun drawn. "Step away!" he roared. The three turned, shock etched on their faces. In that moment, everything fell apart. Sheriff Daniel Carson's command to step away echoed through the trees, carried by the still night air. The three figures in the cabin's soft glow seemed frozen, Emily's face drained of color, Tom Rivers' eyes wide with shock, and Greg Mason's expression a mix of anger and something else that Daniel couldn't quite place. For a long moment, silence hung heavy between them, the kind that precedes the worst kind of storms. "Daniel, put the gun down," Greg said, his voice low and calm, like he was trying to talk down a volatile suspect. But the attempt only fueled Daniel's fury. This was no criminal standoff. This was his life unraveling before his eyes. "Explain yourselves," Daniel demanded, his grip on the revolver firm but trembling slightly. "Now." Emily took a step forward, her hands raised. "It's not what you think, Daniel. Just put the gun down and we can talk." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Don't insult me, Emily. I'm not blind." Tom Rivers shifted uneasily. "Look, Sheriff, no one wants this to get out of hand. We can talk, but not like this." "Oh, we're way past talking, Deputy," Daniel spat, venom dripping from every word. His eyes never left Rivers. "How long has this been going on?" Emily stepped between them, her voice strained. "Daniel, you need to listen." "Don't," he snapped. "Just don't." The weight of betrayal pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. He had trusted these men. He had loved Emily. Now, every memory felt like a cruel joke. He tried to focus, to think clearly, but his mind was a whirlwind of anger, pain, and confusion. "Did you come here to plan your next move?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking. "To decide how to humiliate me further?" "Enough!" Greg's voice was suddenly harsh, breaking the brittle calm. "You don't know what you're talking about, Daniel." Daniel turned on him, eyes blazing. "Then enlighten me." Greg hesitated, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "It's not just about you, Dan. There's more at play here, things you don't understand." "What things?" Daniel barked, his patience fraying. "What could possibly justify this?" Tom's voice cut in, desperate. "Greg, don't..." But it was too late. Whatever unspoken pact they had shattered under the weight of Daniel's accusations. Greg took a deep breath. "You think this is all about betrayal and affairs?" He shook his head. "You have no idea what's been going on in this town." "Stop," Emily pleaded. "Don't do this, Greg." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Greg hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "There's been corruption, money changing hands, deals being made behind closed doors. It goes higher than you think, Daniel. Emily, 'cause she got caught up in it, we all did. It wasn't supposed to be like this." Daniel stared, struggling to process the words. Corruption? Deals? It didn't make sense. He had come here expecting betrayal of one kind, and now he was being told it was something else entirely. But his gut told him Greg was hiding something important. Emily stepped closer, her eyes filled with tears. "I tried to protect you, Daniel. I thought if I could handle it, if I could keep you out of it." "By lying to me?" Daniel's voice was low, dangerous. "By getting involved with them?" Her silence was all the answer he needed. The tension in the room spiked as Tom stepped forward. "We can end this, Sheriff, but you need to lower that gun." Daniel hesitated, 1,000 conflicting thoughts tearing at him. In that moment of hesitation, Greg moved. Fast, too fast. Daniel's instincts kicked in, and he turned the gun on Greg. "Don't!" A sudden crash from outside shattered the moment, a branch breaking, footsteps crunching in the brush. Someone else was out there. Greg used the distraction to lunge. The gun went off, the deafening roar of the shot cutting through the night. Greg fell back, clutching his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. Chaos erupted. Emily screamed. Tom moved, reaching for his sidearm. Daniel spun, adrenaline pumping. But before he could react, the cabin door burst open and figures in dark uniforms stormed in, weapons drawn. "Drop it!" one of them yelled. Daniel's mind reeled. Who were they? Why were they here? In the chaos, he barely registered the emblems on their gear. Federal agents. His world tilted. Nothing made sense anymore. Tom dropped his weapon and raised his hands. "It's not what you think," he yelled to the agents. But the tension, the secrets, the lies, it was too much. Daniel dropped the gun and fell to his knees, the weight of everything crashing down on him. The betrayal, the lies, the corruption, it had all come to a head, and there was no going back. The room was a cacophony of noise and confusion. Federal agents moved swiftly, securing the scene. Guns were holstered, commands were barked, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Sheriff Daniel Carson was dragged to his feet, his head spinning. Blood from Greg Mason's shoulder pooled onto the wooden floor, and Emily's desperate cries filled the air. Nothing about this moment felt real. "Sheriff Carson," one of the agents said, his voice cold and clipped, "you're coming with us." Daniel barely registered the words. His eyes were locked on Emily, who was kneeling beside Greg, applying pressure to the wound. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why did it have to come to this?" But Emily didn't or couldn't answer. The agents marched Daniel outside. The night air hit him like a slap, jolting him back to the harsh reality of his situation. They pushed him into the back of an unmarked SUV, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. Through the window, he watched as paramedics rushed past, sirens wailing. His world was collapsing, and all he could do was watch. The drive was silent. The agent in the passenger seat finally spoke, breaking the oppressive quiet. "You have any idea what you just walked into, Sheriff?" Daniel glared at him through the rearview mirror. "Why don't you tell me?" The agent's lips twisted into something resembling a smile. "This goes way beyond your little love triangle. The operation we've been monitoring for months, you just stepped right into it." Daniel's gut tightened. "Operation," the agent nodded. "Corruption, money laundering, bribery, all woven deep into your county. Greg Mason and Tom Rivers were key players. Your wife, Emily, was a pawn. Or more, depending on who you ask." Rage flared in Daniel's chest. "So what? You let it fester? Let it destroy lives?" The agent's smile disappeared. "You think we wanted this? You think we had a choice? We were building a case. You just complicated it." "Complicated?" Daniel spat. "My life is in ruins." "Your life?" the agent snapped. "We're talking about a network of dirty deals that could bring down state officials. You think your little betrayal matters?" Daniel turned away, staring out the window. Every accusation, every revelation was a dagger. The woman he loved had lied to him. His deputies had betrayed him. And now he was tangled in something far darker than he'd ever imagined. Hours passed before they arrived at the federal building. They led Daniel into a cold interrogation room, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. He was alone for what felt like an eternity before the door creaked open. An older man in a crisp suit entered, a thick file in his hands. "Sheriff Carson," he began, taking a seat across from Daniel. "I'm Agent Carter. You've had quite a night." Daniel said nothing. Carter opened the file. "Your wife and 2 of your deputies have been under surveillance for months. We've been building a case, tracking money transfers, recorded conversations, surveillance footage. It's all here." He tapped the file. "But tonight, you complicated everything." Daniel's jaw clenched. "I didn't know." Carter leaned in. "We believe you, but that doesn't change what happened. You shot a man, Sheriff. And as much as I'd love to sweep that under the rug for the greater good, it's not that simple." "What do you want from me?" Daniel asked, exhaustion creeping into his voice. "Cooperation," Carter said bluntly. We need your help to finish what we started. We have evidence, but we need someone on the inside to connect the dots." "And if I refuse?" Daniel asked. Carter's expression hardened. "Then you'll go down for assault, potentially attempted murder. Your reputation is already in shambles. We'll make sure it stays that way." Silence stretched between them. Daniel's mind raced. His entire life had been built on a foundation of loyalty, honor, and justice. That foundation was now rubble. But if there was even a chance to salvage something, anything— "I'll help," he said finally, his voice hollow. "But I want one thing." Carter raised an eyebrow. "And that is?" "Protect Emily," Daniel said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "No matter what she did, she doesn't deserve to be a casualty." Carter considered this for a long moment. "We'll do what we can." With that, the deal was struck. Over the following weeks, Daniel worked as an informant, feeding information to the feds while pretending to return to his normal life. He spoke to Emily only when necessary, their conversations cold and stilted. Greg survived the shooting but was transferred to another facility under federal custody. Tom Rivers, under surveillance, grew more paranoid by the day. The tension in the air was suffocating. Daniel played his role, gathering intel, setting traps, and watching as the pieces slowly fell into place. But with each passing day, the lines blurred. Betrayal, justice, love, loyalty— it all became a tangled mess. The man he once was no longer existed. One evening, as Daniel sat alone in his office, Carter arrived with news. "It's time," he said. "The operation is coming to a close." "What happens to me?" Daniel asked, his voice flat. "We'll see," Carter replied. "First, we end this." The plan was simple, but execution would be anything but. The final stages of the operation unfolded with a tense and almost cruel precision. Sheriff Daniel Carson, who once held the highest respect in his community, now found himself playing both predator and prey. Every meeting with Emily, every interaction with his colleagues was a test of nerves. The web of deceit grew tighter with each passing day. On August 15th, 2013, everything came to a head. Under the cover of darkness, federal agents surrounded a remote warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, Greg Mason, now under close watch following his recovery, and Tom Rivers met to finalize a deal with a shadowy network of contacts. The feds had waited patiently for this moment, orchestrating every move to ensure all players would be caught red-handed. Daniel arrived at the scene, wearing a wire and fighting the urge to turn back. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, the dim light casting long shadows on the concrete walls. Tom Rivers' gaze met his, cold and calculating. He motioned for Daniel to join him. "We've got business to settle," Tom said, his voice low. "Loose ends to tie up." Daniel nodded, masking his dread with a stoic expression. "What's the plan?" Tom leaned in, his breath hot against Daniel's ear. "First, we make sure no one talks. Then we move forward, you understand?" Daniel swallowed hard. He knew what this meant. Tom's paranoia had reached a boiling point, and loose ends meant anyone perceived as a threat, including Greg, Daniel himself, or even Emily, could be eliminated. The doors creaked open, and Greg walked in, flanked by two men Daniel recognized as hired muscle. He was pale but steady, his eyes darting around the room. "We doing this or what?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Tom nodded. "Let's get it over with." As the men began to exchange documents and encrypted devices, Daniel's pulse quickened. He glanced at the hidden microphone beneath his shirt, praying the feds were ready. Then, with a sudden motion, Tom drew a pistol and pointed it at Greg. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "You've become a liability." Greg's eyes widened. "Tom, wait!" The shot rang out, echoing off the walls. Greg crumpled to the ground, clutching his chest. Blood pooled beneath him, and his gasps filled the room. Time seemed to slow. Daniel's hands shook, but he didn't move. He had to stay in character. The mission wasn't over. "Anyone else got something to say?" Tom demanded, his gaze sweeping the room. Daniel stepped forward, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't the way, Tom. We're better than this." Tom sneered. "You're either with me or against me, Carson. Make your choice." It was the opening Daniel needed. He lifted his hands slowly, feigning surrender, but his thumb pressed against a hidden transmitter, a signal to the feds. Within seconds, the doors burst open, and agents stormed in, weapons drawn. "Drop your weapons!" they shouted. Chaos erupted. Shots were fired, and the room became a blur of movement and noise. Daniel lunged to the side, seeking cover. He saw Tom exchange fire with the agents, his face twisted with rage. The end was inevitable. Tom was outnumbered, cornered, and desperate. In a final act of defiance, Tom raised his gun and aimed at Daniel. "Traitor!" he hissed, but before he could pull the trigger, an agent's bullet found its mark. Tom fell, his eyes wide with shock. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the stench of gunpowder and blood. It was over. Daniel stood, his chest heaving. The reality of what had just happened washed over him. Greg was dead, Tom was dead, and Emily, where was she? He stumbled out of the warehouse, his legs weak. The feds were already securing the scene, arresting the remaining conspirators. Outside, he saw her. Emily stood in the glare of flashing lights, her face pale and streaked with tears. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment everything else faded away. She stepped forward, but agents held her back. Daniel shook his head, the weight of their shattered lives pressing down on him. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift and brutal. The corruption ring was dismantled, and headlines splashed the sordid details across every news outlet. Daniel cooperated fully, providing testimony that helped bring justice to those involved. In return, his sentence was reduced, but his reputation was beyond repair. Emily faced charges of conspiracy, but was granted leniency due to her cooperation. They spoke once, in a sterile visitation room. There were no accusations, no pleading for forgiveness, just a shared understanding of what had been lost. As Daniel walked away, he knew he would carry the scars of betrayal, guilt, and shattered love for the rest of his life. But for now, he had a chance to rebuild, to find a semblance of peace in the ruins of what once was. The story of Sheriff Daniel Carson, his wife's betrayal, and the bloody path it carved would become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how love, greed, and loyalty can collide in the most tragic ways.